Dad reads Sci-fi. The Legacy of Heorot, Chapter 13. Homestead. The dwarf sees further than the giant when he has the giant's shoulder to mount on. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, The Friend. Powdered eggs and powdered milk and freeze-dried bacon didn't seem to be a promising start for breakfast, but in combination with Marianne's skill and the last of the salmon meat, they produced a savory fragrance that drifted up from the pan in thin wisps. Tweedledee and Tweedledum, the twin shepherds, padded quietly around the camp, tongues lolling pinkly, looking hopefully at the fire. They sniffed at the smoke, but kept their distance. They were very polite. Cadman would let them lick the plates. A whiff of ocean salt stirred the leaves and dried grass on the mesa. Avalon's eternal mist was blown away for minutes at a time. From the edge of the mesa, she could look down onto the flatland, where the colony was distantly visible, a flash of solar cell banks, the dim interlocking rectangles of the tilled and irrigated land. The far-off hum of a skeeter tickled the air. A protracted groan issued from the tent behind her, and she turned to watch Cadman elbow himself clumsily out past the flaps. He glared at her, rubbing granular sleep from the corner of his eyes, and grunted, "What the hell are you doing here?" She didn't let him see her flinch. "Cooking breakfast." She stirred the eggs and crumbled in another pinch of dried bacon crisps. Tweedledum, the male, crept up within a meter of the fire, drooling. Cadman shushed him away and crawled up closer, shouldering Marianne gently aside. His bloodshot eyes narrowed with interest. He started to say something, then caught her smiling at him and turned it into a yawn, scratching himself crudely. Marianne caught an awesome whiff of morning breath. Both of Cadman's big hands went to his head. "God, that hurt." "You earned it. You finish off the vodka last night?" "No," he croaked, genuine distress in his voice. His voice sounded as if something small and struggling were trapped in his larynx. Cadman backed into his tent and emerged holding his canteen. He waggled it in one hand, grinning through a week's worth of beard at the answering swish. Hair of the dog. He tossed it back, guzzling with short, choppy movements of his Adam's apple. "Why did you do this to yourself?" "Doesn't matter. You'll have to stop now." He tossed the canteen to the side to clank noisily against a pile of rocks. The dogs attacked him simultaneously from either side, yipping at him to play with them or feed them or any one of 100 other doggy concerns. Cadman wrestled with them for a tolerant moment, then shoved both away and glared at them nastily. "If you don't shut the hell up, I'm going to shoot you both. Going to line you up and shoot you both with the same goddamn bullet. Do you understand me?" They arfed and snapped playfully at each other's tails and ears. Cadman stretched, naked but for a baggy pair of shorts. His muscular arms were only fractionally better tanned than his chest. He's lost weight, the wounds, and then the drinking. Marianne stopped stirring the eggs as the first curl of smoke wafted up from the pan. "What in the hell is that mess?" "Call it an Avalon omelet. It's our breakfast," she said. He thrust a fork into the pan, probing, and snapped at her. "How much of it is poison?" She took the fork and shoveled a bite into her own mouth, glaring right back. "Half, eh? Well, I'm tough. I can handle that." He tried to sit in a gracefully cross-legged position, but finally just sort of collapsed into a heap. "My head. Your breath. Here, eat." Cadman took the fork back and scraped half the contents of the pan onto a plate. The suspicion in his eyes faded after the first bite. "Damn, this isn't half." At the first sign of her smile, he shut up and hunched over the pan, sulking as he ate. Marianne poured reconstituted non-fat milk and sipped contentedly. It was startlingly clean and aerated, filled with tiny needle-like ice crystals from the snowmelt stream that ran near Cadman's campsite. Drunk, hurt, mad, and he still picked a better place than Zach ever did. She squinted across the fire at Cadman. Time. Yes, while the hangover lasts. "You can forget about me going back to the colony. I'm staying. You can carry me down, but I'll just climb back. If you want to break both of my legs, that might stop me, but I wouldn't bet on it." You are going, he said. He ate the last forkful of the eggs, squinted at her, and belched with satisfaction. Right after lunch. Keep the head down. One of Cadman's broad hands clamped onto the back of her neck as they crouched behind an outcropping of rock near the eastern edge of the mesa. Damn hangfires. Brap! The sound was not as loud as Marianne expected, but she heard it as much with her body as her ears. The shaped engineering charge rent the mountainside. Rock chips and clots of dirt flew in all directions. A gout of dust and powdered earth mushroomed into the sky. Crouching next to her, Cadman grinned. Fun, eh? She bobbed her head nervously. Finest kind. His hands were gentle as he helped her to her feet. Shielding his eyes against the dust, he surveyed his handiwork. The third detonation of the day completed a hole in the granite face 20 meters above the mesa. It looked very like the opening excavation of a mine. Shelf-like slabs of rock jutted out from the earth, their ends shattered by the concussion. I'm not sure I understand why you don't just build on the flat. Weren't you in the camp? She heard the sarcasm change to something else. He stared at her. Marianne. His voice softened. Yeah, well, there are monsters here. I know that. So I don't want to be on the flat. I want the flatland for farming, if I decide to stay. All of the farmland will be worth its acreage in gold foil. Second, drainage. If I build underground on the hillside, rain and snowmelt will run right off, if I build my roof right. Third, view. From where I'll have the best damn view that ever was. Right down on their heads. And fourth, I want us to be unreachable. One path, and it twists, and I'll guard it. I won't be on some tabletop watching one of those things come at me at 90 miles an hour. She saw it now, and her ears burned. My God, of course not. Why didn't I see the way he looked at me? Oh, it was a stupid question, wasn't it? Cadman, I know. I can accept it. But, well, sometimes it hurts. His hand moved to touch hers, then drew back. She held her breath. He turned away to survey his work, then turned back, a deeply satisfied smile creasing his face. There are more reasons, but those will do for the moment. He looked at her sharply. Nobody's asking you to live in it, or to stay here. I'm staying. She stood on her tiptoes and locked her arms around his neck. I love you, Cadman. I lost too much coming to Avalon. I'm not losing you too. He reached back to unfasten her fingers from the back of his neck, but she clung too tightly, and finally he just met her eyes squarely. You do things my way, he said. If you don't like it, go home. Down there, things can be whatever way people decide by vote that they should be. This is not a democracy. Up here, I'm the bottom line. Male chauvinist, she said, kissing him lightly. I'm a me chauvinist. I'd probably be the same way if I was a woman. I just want you to get this straight before we start anything. I love you, she repeated. The rock dust at the corner of her eyes was slightly muddied. Love, honor, and obey. Isn't that what women used to promise? I will, you know. He gave her a hard, brief hug. Then let's get started. Aye, aye, sir. What first? Defenses. Notice anything about our house site? Many things. Boulder, that one. Big. And it will roll once I dig it out. So I dig. Put chocks under it first. Levers on the chocks. Anyone wants to come up the path without permission? Anyone? Or anything. If it comes up and we don't like it, we roll the boulder down. I'm for that. What next? Terrace down the hill. Vegetable garden. Divert some water from the Amazon to keep the vegetables happy, and us too. Then finish the house. I have to finish the excavation by hand to make sure that I have the dimensions that I want. Then I level the floor and set the corner posts. That will take about 3 weeks. She smiled uneasily. 3 weeks. Cadman, how long are you planning to stay up here? It was the wrong thing to say, and she knew it instantly. Until I'm finished. Until I feel like going the hell back down. And the instant you don't like it up here, go. Cadman tore her hand loose from around his neck, and without another word, opened the box of tools and building supplies that he had skeetered up from the camp. He was still limping. A tireless machine made of polished hickory and leather. That's what Cadman seemed to her. For all his injuries and his age, he worked on and on when she was exhausted, when the youngest, strongest men in the colony would have collapsed and begged for rest. He worked 8 hours a day, digging, shoring, piling, building ridges of earth that would later become garden or upper patio. No effort was lost. He never hauled any dirt or stone uphill. He built on the hill, and he planned carefully, and every wheelbarrow of earth and rock moved downhill to the growing garden structure. In some ways, the excavation was beginning to look like a smallish swimming pool, with the deep end, 9 feet deep, at the lowest part and the shallow higher. He cut deep steps into the hill above the excavation, so that the entire cavity measured 5 meters along the bottom edge and 12 meters along each side. When he was through with the morning's work, Cadman stretched and took off with Tweedledee to check the traps. Marianne had found another difference between the twins. Tweedledee's right ear was a bit, or more precisely, a bite, short, a souvenir of a kennel brawl that had become serious. And here she was able to accompany him, learning to set the wire, spring traps that Cadman set for the slow, almost friendly mammaloids that Cadman called Dopey Joes. He said it was a literary reference. At first she was able to do little but help him haul dirt and cook the meals and clean the camp. But it was too easy for her to remember a time when she had been one of the most competent women on the expedition, and there was no new way that she could remain satisfied with this new role. She learned to set traps. Nets in the stream that ran past the side of the house from the heights of the Mucking Great Mountain, a tiny ice-melt stream Cadman had named the Amazon. With a large-mouthed basket in one hand and Tweedledee's leash in the other, she explored the mountain, learning the paths and the patches of sliding rock. And it was among them that she found Missy. The snares were set near any of the half-dozen or so bushes and plants that showed the characteristic gnawed parallel tooth marks. One patch of plants interested her. They were green and broad-leaved, with thick yellow veins branching from a central stem. The flowers were delicate pink, with tiny red berries clustered in the center. None of its flowers were chewed or gnawed, but the roots and leaves were the favorite food of some local creature. When she took a closer look at the flowers, she noted a dusting of dried insect segments and more dead, delicately winged husks on the ground beneath the blossoms. The word poison flashed through her mind, and she was pleased with herself for making the connection. Something was rustling behind the bush, and she carefully pulled the branches aside. There, its neck caught in a chew-proof nylon spring loop, was 18 inches of furred frustration. The Joe had huge orange eyes almost too large for its face. The eyes were imploring, terrified, confused. They reminded her of... what was it? What? She stomped her foot in frustration and forgot about it. The creature was in one of the snares, bleeding from the throat, twisting and spitting at her. Tweedledee barked, and the little Joe almost broke its own neck trying to escape. She poked it into the basket and then cut it loose from the snare. It chattered at her. "Well, Missy," Marianne said, "can't blame you for being upset." Tarsier, that was the word she had searched for. An equatorial primate, the owner of the largest eyes of any mammal, found in the forests of Malaysia and the Philippines. She laughed in relief. It was still there. Some of the information was still in her mind. She just couldn't call it up on command as once she had. Maybe she could restructure the way she thought. She shook the cage and held it up close to her face. "Are you a good luck charm, Missy?" Missy spat at her and tried to hide in a corner of the basket. She was more slender than a tarsier, almost like a thick-furred lizard. She laid on her back, claws out, and scrabbled blindly. On their way back down, Tweedledee suddenly strained at the leash. tugging so hard that Mary almost dropped the basket. Tweedledee yipped hysterically, struggling to climb up into the rocks. Missy went absolutely apeshit, squealing and clawing in the wired cage. "Dee Dee, get back here!" Mary Ann yelled, suddenly suspicious. Reluctantly, the shepherd came back down, tail folded contritely between her legs. Mary Ann wound the leash tightly around a rock, then climbed up and took a closer look, Missy chattering more loudly. Her ears were rewarded before her eyes. She heard a thin mewling sound that reminded her of nothing so much as the cry of kittens, starving for milk. There were 6 of them, curled up around each other like a tangle of hairy rope. They were just babies, barely able to wiggle. One lay still. It seemed dead. The others looked up at her with curiosity untainted by fear. Mary Ann glanced from the wire cage to the babies, and sudden inspiration struck. Missy was climbing up the sides of the basket, and Mary Ann thumped her back down, throwing handfuls of Avalonia grass and leaves into the cage until the bottom was completely matted. Then she carried the basket up the defile to the rocks. Missy chattered even more frantically now. Down below, Tweedledee leaped and danced, yipping enthusiastically. Mary Ann braced herself between the rocks, thankful now for hours of jogging, because her calves were starting to burn from all the climbing. She reached down into the crevice and gently drew up one of the Joe kittens. It struggled and bit her hand, a scratch, hardly enough to break the skin. Mary Ann set the furball back down and pulled her jacket sleeve down over her hand in a makeshift glove. This time, she couldn't feel the teeth at all when she transferred the second Joe into the basket. Mary Ann had to knock Missy down from the side of the cage again, and then a third time when she tried to bite through the jacket. When the first baby was deposited in the cage, Missy scampered around and around in a furry flash before finally slowing down. She sniffed at her child, then licked, and finally wound herself around the kitten, enveloping it. One at a time, Mary Ann transplanted the Joes to the cage. Then she trundled it back to Tweedledee. The mother chattered up at her vilely, then continued to tie her children into a ball for maximum warmth and protection. Mary Ann lifted the last small, sad body down in the crevice and shook her head. "Time to head back to Camp D," she said, unleashing the dog. She stood with small fists on hips, looking around the area. What did these things eat? The adults, anyway. The Joes looked close enough to mammalian. There would be some sort of milk gland for the young. There were several types of plants, a kind of lichen or moss, seemed to be breaking down some of the rocks, and a viney thing that resembled a colony of long-legged spiders. It grew out of the rock in symbiotic relationship with the moss. There were shrubs up here, and flowering plants, which she had noticed from the helicopter. Which would the Joe family prefer? She took a chance, the broad-leafed plant that had concealed the snare. She tore loose a cluster of red berries and dropped them into the cage. Nothing. Mama Joe ignored them. Still following the hunch, she tore loose a clutch of leaves, sorted through them for the tenderest, and dropped them in. Missy sprang on them. After careful sniffing, she began to chew. Well, that answered that. Feeling absurdly proud of herself, Mary Ann carried the cage back down to the camp. The sun was unusually warm, and the air sweet, and her mind was already buzzing with ideas for cages. There was something bothering her about the enclave she had found. What was it? It was beautiful, more lush than anything she had seen down in the flatlands. Down on the flatlands, there was little in the way of tender shrubs. Only the gnarled thorn bushes seemed to thrive down there. More variation of plant life at a higher altitude? And come to think of it, animal life too. That implied something. But what? What? Her mind wasn't clear enough, and she cursed softly. Damn it. Why wouldn't it come into focus? Suddenly all the pleasure she had felt disappeared in a welter of frustration. Why wouldn't her mind work for her? Hibernation and stability. There. Say it. Accept it. Don't try to pretend that it didn't affect you, as some of the others do. Don't try to pretend you still have capacities that have fled. That kind of egotistical nonsense gets you laughed at or killed. Work within your limits and learn the steps you always pitied tweens for having to take. Where a bright can lead, a tween can follow. There used to be such smugness in the saying. A genius can take huge leaps, wearing intuitive 7-league boots. Then a corps of engineers and technicians can turn the theories into inventions and principles. A competently trained repairman can fix something that took a genius to devise in the first place. I lost my 7-league boots, but the germplasm is still mine. We can make good kids. All right, there was something wrong here. But if she had the time and the patience, she could reconstruct the thought processes that once came to her so easily. And it was important for her to reconstruct these. Very important. With the basket in hand, she traveled back down the hill. Marianne found it amazing. In 3 weeks, using a constant, unvarying work schedule, Cadman had carved the patio and shoring, tamped down the floor of his new house, and covered it with layers of polyethylene sheeting. He had set the corner posts using the lightweight foam steel braces ferried down from the zero-grav smelting facility aboard Geographic, and lined the walls with more of the polyethylene. The roof girders and additional support beams were finally in place. Cadman disassembled their tent and laid it across the top in a makeshift roof, and they spent their first night in the new home. The northern wall was earth, but the southern, uphill side was open to the broad, high steps that Cadman had cut into the mountainside. Their stove warmed the makeshift dwelling beautifully, and there was plenty of headroom and walking space, more than in some of the 1800s pioneer cabins she had visited in Kentucky museums. They sat cross-legged in the shelter. The stove and the body heat of the 2 dogs were quite enough to keep her warm as she wrote. 2 sheets of paper were spread out, and on one she was listing every plant Missy had accepted as food. So far, there were 6 varieties. The other sheet was blank. I ought to be recording something, but I don't know what it is. Damn. But I am useful. Cadman built it, but it's our house. The earth that surrounded them on 3 sides was terrific insulation, and there was something womb-like about it. So I'm missing some brain cells. I had billions to spare. She heard Missy's angry clattering in the distance. 4 of the youngsters had survived with her, and were old enough to run around the cage. If they could be bred... A garden there, Cadman said with vast contentment, pointing back at the series of deep rising steps cut into the mountain behind the house. Hanging garden, climbing, I forget what you call it. Walk path cut in the middle. We'll be able to mount mirrors at the top. We already get full sunlight as it crosses east to west. We can do even better. Roof next, and we'll top it with soil. He laughed lazily. We could plant on a roof if we wanted to. It would be nice to have a little more natural light. Marianne folded the sheet of paper and tucked it in with her backpack. He sipped at his coffee and then put an arm around her. It still sent a shiver of pleasure through her to feel it. They hadn't slept together for the first week, and when he had finally taken her into his bedroll and made love to her, it had been an angry, demanding, selfish kind of love, and she had not demanded in return. She was happy to be able to give. But now, as his house was taking form, as the Joes and turkeys filled their cages and makeshift pens, as the plot of worked land doubled and trebled, and the mesa became Cadman's Bluff, his personality and signature scrawled more boldly upon it hour by hour. He was softer with her at the end of the day, and spoke of us, and we. And she was happy, despite her frequently aching muscles. In the weeks since the attack on the camp, Cadman seemed to have purged his anger. It had taken useful work, done his way, in his time, to his ends, and the fruits of that labor were his. She moved closer to him and kissed his shoulder gently. "I'll dig the channel tomorrow," he said. "I need the channel before I can blast. Marianne, I think I can run the channel through the house, through the living room." For what? Oh, the Amazon, she remembered. He wanted to divert water for the vegetable garden. Something ticked at her memory. Falling Water? What? I remembered. Falling Water. A House by Frank Lloyd Wright. and the water ran right through the living room. That's what I was trying to remember. You're amazing. I've never felt like this, she thought to herself, and I've been married and in love before, and have had enough lovers to know the difference. There was something about the darkness and the warmth, about being next to a man who had built his dwelling by the strength of his back and his wits. Something about watching Cadman rediscovering himself and her that made her feel warm and small and protected. Protected. A competent, civilized human being didn't need a protector. Mary Ann Eisenhower, Ph.D. in agricultural sciences, had been quite capable of taking care of herself. Thank you. She remembered the doctor. She remembered. Now she was the dependent of a brawny, self-sufficient warrior. And yet there was no cruelty in this man. No demand for her subservience or helplessness. She was sure that he had accepted her because she could do certain things. She could take care of herself. She could go when she wished, and he made that clear. Yet he had accepted with pleasure her suggestions about breeding the Joes. She wanted to do anything for him. But if he ever abused her, that urge would vanish. How strange and how wonderful. How natural to be here in the earth, huddled with the man she loved, who she hoped one day would love her in return. So there, Sylvia. She grinned fiercely, briefly, and kissed his shoulder, her lips parting slightly, tongue flickering out to taste the salt dried on the skin. He pulled her to him, and there, in their home, made love to her on the packed earth of the floor, and they rejoiced together until both were exhausted, until sleep stole the thoughts from her mind as she curled against his side. The two of them, surrounded by their home, their dogs, the whispering wind, and the small night sounds, together. Cadman had finished digging the French drain, the rock-filled slit, a foot wide, 5 feet long and 3 deep, at the uphill mouth of their home. It would trap rain or snowmelt before it could flood their home, and was just another of the little things, the 1,000 little things that Cadman had done to their home, to make it safe and warm and ideal for her, for them. Their home was roofed now and planted with grass seed. Rows of strawberries and lettuce and carrots and corn stretched across the mesa, wherever there was enough soil to give anything a chance. Much of it would be lost. She expected the strawberries and the hybrid melon cactus to do the best. 2 pens of captured turkeys and their cage of Joes were thriving, and as she fed the Joes their morning leaves, they were actually happy to see her. The kittens had sprouted into 12-inch furred lovelies, only slightly less beautiful and better tempered than young foxes. The furs would be useful, and the flesh. A sudden cramping wave of nausea fanned through her, and she doubled, gasping, choking back the sour fluid in her throat. This was the 3rd morning that morning. She grinned, looking up at Cadman, toiling at the drainage slit. Mary Ann threw the rest of the leaves into the cage and dusted off her hands. Well, Missy, I think that I have some news for Madman Wayland. Joe looked up at Mary Ann and chattered friskily. Guess who's coming to dinner? Call her Mama. The taste of the river changed with the seasons. For a time, the river would run sluggish and cold. Then the taste of life was scarce. The flying things were scarce. The swimming things were dead. Later the water would race, carrying the taste of past times. Mama had seen scores of cycles of seasons. She was wise enough to ignore the ancient tastes, bodies or blood or feces of life her kind had long since exterminated, long buried in mountain ice, released as the ice melted. In the hot season, the waters would be bland again, carrying only spore of flyers and swimmers and another of her own race. Mama's taste was discriminating. One of her kind lived upstream. Another lived even farther upstream, and that one was a weakling. It lived where game was so scarce that Mama could taste starvation in its spore. Not worth killing, that one, or her nearer rival would have taken her domain. In winter, there was something strange in the water, something she couldn't identify. Not life. Not interesting. The world began to warm again, and something new was on the island. Something she had never tasted. Something weirdly different was leaving spore in the water. It was as yet too faint to identify. Mama began to think about moving. If she followed that spore, she would have to fight, and that was no step to be taken lightly. By summer, she could taste several varieties of prey. The things weren't merely leaving feces in the water. She tasted strange blood, too. Her rival was eating well. Was it time? Her rival was youthful. Mama could taste that, but large. The faintness of her scent placed her many days' journey upstream. She would be rested and fed when Mama arrived, and Mama settled back into her pool. She had not lived 2 scores of cycles by being reckless. If her rival sickened, she would taste it. Days flickered past. The time of cold had come. Ordinarily, Mama scarcely noticed passing time, for the taste of swimmer meat was always the same. Nothing attacked. Her curiosity lay dormant, but it was active now, for living things were leaving spore even in dead of winter, and blood ran down the river now and again. Oh, the variety! Here was blood from something vaguely like a flyer. This one must have been big, a plant eater. She had to dig far into her memory to find anything similar. That horrible chemical stench was entirely mysterious. Hot metal and belly acid and thoroughly rotted grass. This unfamiliar scent, judged by its components, would be the urine of a meat eater, not of her kind. Hunger and curiosity warred with discretion, for Mama had never tasted anything like that, nor seen one either. Once there was a living thing in the water. She snapped it up and chewed contemplatively, trying to learn of it. A swimming thing. Primitive. Built a little like a swimmer. The world was warming when the river gifted her with 2 larger members of the same species. Bottom feeders tasting of mud. They must be breeding despite the presence of her rival upstream. And that, one bright hungry morning, was the burnt blood of her own kind. Taste of fear and speed and killing rage. Taste of chemicals. Taste of burning. If lightning or a forest fire had killed her rival, then an empty territory lay waiting for her upstream. If another rival, then Mama would face a formidable foe. The swimmers were startled when Mama came forth in an eating frenzy. Swimmers were nothing. The taste did not engage her curiosity at all. But Mama's rival would be fat now, and hyperkinetic from impact of sensory stimuli, and Mama dared not come upon her as a desperate starveling. She had not fought a serious rival in many years.